Nancy Osball with the North Manchester Historical Society. And since it's November and the start of basketball is just around the corner, we thought we would present a program about Indiana basketball, Indiana's first love and first game. So today with me I have a special guest who is a legend of basketball and has great knowledge of Indiana's favorite game. I think every Indiana family has basketball in its history somewhere, in its story. Mine is my father, who used to play for the LeGros High School Comets in 1946. And almost every Indiana family roots for some basketball team during this season. Me, I root for the Manchester Squires and of course the Purdue Boilermakers. And everyone has its favorite, his or her favorite team and player. So we're going to hear about some of the legends that have made up the stories of Indiana basketball. Bob Adams is with us today, and Bob is going to talk about Indiana basketball and share his love of the game with us. Bob?
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me. I started out several years ago. By the way, when you were talking about basketball, I think this quote's attributed to Bobby Knight, but it could have been anybody. Basketball may have been invented in Massachusetts, but it was made for Indiana. So that's one of the best quotes you'll ever hear.
Yes.
Yeah. I started out about probably 30 years ago now. I traveled at the time for my job. I traveled 3 states, and I don't drink or party, so a lot of times if I was away from home at night or late in the day, I would stop at whatever little town I was in and look for a library and try to find a school. You'd be amazed how many small towns I was in and ask people where the school is or was, and nobody had any idea. So that's, of course, they've been going now for a lot of them for 50 or 60 years. But I started collecting pictures. And when I was a student here at Manchester College, a lot of days I would just get out and roll around with a few of my friends, and we would hit some of these small towns and see these little schools. And my wife and I used to travel back and forth between Muncie and Fort Wayne, and would drive the back roads and see some of the little schools along the back roads. So that's really what got me interested. And I put together a book probably 30 years ago. I knew a fellow that collected postcards of old high schools and was able to take some pictures. Back then there were still a lot of the old high schools were still standing. And I put together a book, I called it Silence Bells, and it was all the schools. It didn't include any of the current schools, like I use the example of Yorktown's still a school, Muncie Burris is still a school. Those aren't in the book, but the schools like I went to, Eaton, Albany, DeSoto, Rorton, are in the book because they have closed and basically disappeared. There's no more buildings there. So I put together a book called Silence Bells, and I think at the last count I had, there was 1,176 schools in the IHSAA sectionals, basketball sectionals between 1915 and 1997. 1915 was the first sectionals, and 1997 was the last full class section. And so if they were in and out during that period of time, they're including the book. I had at one point in time had 1,150 of the 1,176 high schools I had pictures of, and many of the schools had more than one high school. Montmorency, there were 4 different high schools. In the late, there were a lot of, fire was an enemy of the school because there were a lot of schools that burnt down, and in many cases that ended the school as a school, and the students were shipped other places. My wife had an uncle that graduated from Eaton. He grew up in Gaston, and the Gaston school had burnt, and for 1 year the kids went either to Summitville or they went to Eaton, and so her uncle just decided that year to go to Eaton, and there's a picture of him in the yearbook. He was a cheerleader, and she had no idea, her dad had no idea that this had gone on. But anyway, it was real interesting finding out about these old schools. And the schools they built in the 1880s and 1890s basically looked like houses. They were big brick houses. In the southern part of the state, they were probably wood. There were a lot of wooden houses down there, or wooden schools. Then in the started about 1912 to 1930 or so. All the buildings started looking a lot alike, and were more or less what we considered the high schools that I'm a little older, but that I went to looked a lot like that. They did it a lot different back then than they do now. They would hire a general contractor, and then the general contractor, whatever township they were in, he would hire township people to fill that, because back then the farmers could build things, and it was basically outside of the large cities, people basically farmed, and they could do a lot of different things, move dirt, things like that, and you could work off your taxes working on the school, and a lot of people took advantage of that. So a lot of the schools were actually contracted with local labor, and in this portion of Indiana, the clay that made the bricks were actually farmed from the area. There was Kirkland Township in Adams County. The bricks were actually farmed about 6 miles away, and they loaded them on a rail car and got as close to the school they could and unloaded them from there. So there was a lot of local things and local flavor. They did the Pleasant Mills basketball court. The coach at the time, they didn't have an indoor court. Coach at the time went around to all the people in the township and collected all their signatures, except for one person wouldn't sign it. And they built what was considered at the time the finest gym in Adams County. The superintendent picked each piece of wood for the floor. Each went through, like, say a normal floor would use a truckload. He went through 4 truckloads of wood picking out wood for his floor. So they took a lot of pride in what they did. So I tried to record that, and then moved on to, I was contacted by Arcadia Publishing, and put together a book called Hoosier High School Basketball. And this book, it was kind of funny. One of my best friends collected yearbooks. He had over 2,000 high school yearbooks. And he started out, he was from Pleasant Mills, and he started out just collecting yearbooks from schools that Pleasant Mills played. And then, but a lot of times he would go someplace and they would offer him, okay, that one's $5, but I'll sell you 4 of them for $10 or something, And so he started collecting yearbooks and had over 2,000. And it was easy enough to go through there and get pictures of the schools in a lot of cases, or get pictures of the coaches, or get pictures of the team. And so that got me started on the Arcadia book. I went through and scanned a bunch of pictures. Some of them I took, some of them he had, and it soon turned into a book that's been out there for 20 years now, and it's still selling pretty good. Which at one point in time I was number 110,647 on the Amazon bestseller list.
Yeah, and of course we have a book that was also done for our Wabash County basketball, and is a wonderful resource if you're interested in learning more about Wabash County basketball, and you can purchase those at the Historical Museum here, the Center for History, and I believe also at the Wabash Museum as well. So, so that would be an opportunity to learn more about Wabash County basketball history.
We did, I did radio for 19 years, did football, basketball, volleyball. We did a track meet every year, baseball, softball, so we did a lot of different sports. And we came over to Wabash High School one year for a ball game, and I was really impressed that they had all of their 1,000-point scores up on the wall there, and very few schools did that. Very few schools do that, and it's just on getting to 100 wins as a coach or 1,000 points as a player is really quite the achievement. We'll get into this in just a minute, but it's really quite an achievement, and it's nice when they recognize these things. So then the last project I've been working on for the last 3 years, I've been trying to collect the names of the coaches and the season records for all the schools in the state, and that's quite an undertaking. It's a huge file on my computer, believe me, and I keep adding to it. I have access to a lot of different newspapers on the computer, and go through those. Basically, go through them a year at a time. You got to go through each school each year, and my main interest there was not so much all the information that's on the school, but was trying to follow these coaches from school to school. There was one coach that coached at 15 different schools, and there was another one that coached at 13 different schools. And so just following from school to school, and also correcting their records. Have you heard of Howard Sharp?
Yes.
Okay.
Kokomo.
Howard Sharp was coached in Terre Haute, and there were two Howard Sharps. One of them had an E on his name, and the other one didn't. And the Howard Sharp at Terre Haute did not have the E on his name.
Okay.
But anyway, he would point to these pile of records and say, I won 650 ball games or whatever it was. Well, one of the guys in a basketball group I was involved with went through and checked his records, and he could find records. He could find confirmation all but 2 ball games, and his total was way less. Well, then he went through and he had a list of players that scored 1,000 points. So this fellow went through and added up all their points. Their points were way less. So some people weren't always entirely truthful about, it's like I was a great athlete in high school. I tell people that because there's not many people left when I was in high school to dispute it. But that's kind of what it was. But we just the basketball group was started to verify all of these claims that people were making. So.
And there is great interest in the history of Indiana.
Oh yeah.
No doubt.
You can go on the internet. Of course, Bill Harrell's got a huge site. Hickory Husker, Lee Evans has a huge site, and I have been fortunate enough. The other thing I like about it, I've been in a lot of great gyms broadcasting on the radio, number one, and number two, I've met a lot of great individuals, and some of them nobody has ever heard of before, but they were actually pretty good high school ball players, and in some cases even college ball players, but because they were from LaGrow or Eaton or Monmouth or wherever, that nobody heard of them. And that was the other thing that makes all this stuff kind of difficult, because the newspapers didn't cover Decatur. Adams County at one point in time had 10 high schools. Randolph County at one point in time had 18. Huntington, I think, was the largest consolidation, and it had 16 or 17 schools. So they couldn't, newspapers couldn't afford to send a sports writer out to each one of these ball games each week, and in some cases twice a week. And so they were relying on the coaches to call them in. Well, if the coach won, he might be so happy he forgot it. If he lost, he wasn't going to tell them, So some of those things are really hard to dig out, and it makes it a little bit more interesting to do. So, but it's been a lot of fun. I know we were talking earlier, and I said, my problem is that when I'm looking through, I'm a great history buff, and I do a lot of genealogy, and looking through all these things, all of a sudden you see this story or that story that looks like it might be interesting. One of the stories I ran into the other day, and I want to say it was either Sharpsville or Fishers in 1928. Both of those schools burnt down. One of the schools, nobody knew the fire was gone until the kids came to school, and the article reported the students helped fight the fire.
Oh my goodness.
And a lot of times they would, Yankeetown comes to mind way down south. Fishers was another one. They by the next week they had located enough room in various buildings to hold school. And Macy, was it Macy? There were other schools that were like that. Some of the schools, once they burnt, they were done. They just never regained their, if they burnt during the war, of course there weren't materials to build new schools. There may not have been enough money. The school might have been insured for $5,000, and at that point in time it would take $20,000 to rebuild it. Money wasn't available, so they would ship students to other schools. There was a little school in Jay County called Gray High School. It was outside of Red Key it's kind of on the well, it's pretty close to Randolph County. Randolph County had a school called Jefferson. It wasn't Jefferson Township, it was just Jefferson. And they consolidated with, I'm drawing a blank, but anyway, they consolidated with another, there were two schools in the township, and they closed one and used the other. And the grade school was not very good shape. And so one of the things that they looked at seriously was busing the grade students to Jefferson Township to finish school. I mentioned Eaton earlier. The Gaston school had burnt, and took them about a year to get another building put up. And during that year, they split their students between Summitville and Eaton, with the majority of them going to Summitville. So they had, all of a sudden, both schools had more students than they knew what to do with, but just for a year. But they did all kinds of things. Lagodi St. John's, they went to Lagodi High School for a while, and when their school started having problems, and they had a religious school in with a public school.
Yeah.
And so that created problems, but they had the nuns teaching along the side of it. So they did all kinds of interesting things,
Yeah.
and they made it work.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks so much, Bob. We appreciate your insight and knowledge, and we want to encourage people to check out the resources we've shown you today, and we certainly hope that everybody enjoys this wonderful upcoming Indiana high school basketball season. Thanks.